Spending time in nature always helps me feel connected to the place I live. And typically, that bond is shaped through photography. The simple act of exploring with a camera and being curious about what I see. I'm not an expert in any of it, but there are some habitats where I find myself particularly out of my depth. Among the most mysterious to me are our shifting intertidal zones. Recently, I read Life Between the Tides, Adam Nicolson's deeply immersive meditation on these places. He describes life in rock pools as tough, with wildly fluctuating temperatures and salinity. But the book is as philosophical as it is scientific, and it left me with a new sense of wonder. I realised I'd been sleeping on the opportunity to glimpse the unfamiliar marine life that gather in basins of seawater along the shore. It was time to go tidepooling. After some brief research, I learned that Duxbury Reef was an ideal location. The State Marine Conservation Area is home to a large protected shale reef where nutrient-rich waters from the Gulf of the Farallones nourish an extraordinary community of animals and plants. It was a hot summer afternoon, so I was glad for the ocean breeze and I knew heat distortion wouldn't be an issue here. But, in true amateur fashion, I'd chosen a bad time to visit. A crucial element for tidepooling is a low tide. And it turns out that in summer, low tides are typically much earlier in the day here. When I arrived, the tide was high and would only recede briefly, so I downgraded my expectations to a scouting mission. I took a moment to think about the cast of characters I hoped to see. Mussels, urchins, anemones and hermit crabs all came to mind, but photographing an octopus or a sea star would be the dream. With the gravitational pull of the moon a little beyond my control though, I'd take whatever I could find. The first living things I discovered were unlikely to stay that way for long. By-the-wind sailors glimmered in the sunlight, freshly run aground by the waves. Each glass-like sailor knows how to go with the flow. They cruise along, completely at the mercy of the wind and waves, and epitomising the power of the tide. I learned that they're not actually a single organism, they're a colony of tiny polyps that survive as a team. Beautiful but strange. That's what I meant when I said life here felt alien to me. With the reef mostly underwater, I began exploring where I could. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the next things that caught my eye were marine snails and crustaceans. Lined shore crabs hurried along the rocks and backed into crevices. It was fun to try some new photography techniques, but a polarising filter would have been helpful in cutting through the surface glare. I tried dipping an action camera into these pockets of seawater and panning around. Nicolson described the underwater view as a parkland of beauty, and I began to see why. Right on schedule, the tide turned. With each retreating wave, more of the reef was revealed, but the process was painfully slow. I wasn't the only one impatiently waiting. Black oyster catchers were accumulating on the rocks, so I amused myself watching them. Ultimately, the tide didn't move far enough before it was time for me to leave. Still, I'd found my bearings, and I was ready to try again at low tide. On my second visit, I arrived at first light, and the reef was largely exposed, with rock pools stretching into the distance. The tide was low, but rising, so I decided to start close to the water and work my way back. The next few hours were a lot of fun, wandering around and studying individual pools. The intertidal zone is characterised by constant dramatic change. Submerged in cool salt water one moment, exposed to warm air the next. I could only imagine the resilience marine life needed to thrive here. The conditions made photography challenging too, but I learned a few things. Firstly, I realised just how hard it is to move without disturbing any creatures. Every step is a matter of life and death for the tiny creatures that congregate there, so I tried to be as careful as possible. Equally, It's hard enough to manage multiple cameras and lenses, but when you're doing it all on slippery rocks surrounded by corrosive salt water, I felt like an accident waiting to happen. Secondly, life began to emerge when I sat quietly and observed. Camouflaged creatures like tidepool sculpin were hard to see, and my shadow easily spooked them if I moved too fast. Another reason to take my time. And finally, photographing anything through water is tough. A polarizer helps to cut through the glare, but you still need a lot of light, and even then, images are usually soft. My photos were hit and miss under these conditions. That morning, I was fortunate to see an incredible variety of wildlife. But when I found a giant green anemone, it brought back to me the idea of just how unfamiliar life feels in these spaces. At first glance, it looked like a harmless flower, but these creatures are predators, equipped with stinging cells on their tentacles to paralyse their prey. I don't know why you'd want to, and please don't, but apparently if you cut some anemones in half, each part is capable of growing into a whole new individual. We share this coastline, but our realities are wildly different. Eventually, as the tide crept back across the reef to flood the pools I was exploring, it was time to leave. I realised that I'd never found the octopus or sea star I'd hoped for, but then, as if by magic, I noticed a tiny sea star clinging to a rock. It turned out to be a dwarf mottled Henricia, one of the smallest sea stars in the region. I knelt down to photograph its elegant dappled textures, and within minutes it disappeared under the rising tide. A perfect, fleeting example of how beautiful life can be in this place of constant change. Transient, precarious, and magnificent.